Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Testing in Bahrain begins tomorrow. Reports are emerging that the FIA have declared Mercedes W15's controversial new front wing as legal going into the upcoming season. But if it delivers the expected performance Mercedes are looking for and other teams are caught off guard, they may well try and find a way and have a few ideas up their sleeve on how they can try and get the FIA to change their mind on this one. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. The Netflix teaser as well for the Drive to Survive series are here. This was a phenomenal image here of Toto Wolff actually in what seems to be behind the scenes footage of a negotiation between Toto Wolff and Lewis Hamilton. Now, of course, it won't go into the full details, but there have been some debates as to whether this was the moment that Toto and Hamilton realised this might not necessarily last the test of time. Now, there's lots of questions on Helmut Marko and Christian Horner right now and the situation at Red Bull. Marko has actually said something else on the Horner investigation. He still doesn't say much, which is pretty rare for Marko, but he does say the following: as you know, this is an internal investigation. The sooner a result is available, the better, because of course rumours and other stories are bound to sprout due to the long duration. But I think Red Bull has reacted very well in this matter. The long duration of this investigation is not their fault. They are endeavouring to have a fair investigation and then react accordingly, which is probably fair enough. I guess the question is that if it is as severe as the rumours are indicating that it is, why is Horner still in his role? Maybe it would be customary in other instances of this that maybe the person in question would be suspended for a period of time before the investigation comes to its conclusion. That's not the case. Horner remains in charge. We believe that he's in Bahrain today ahead of the test beginning tomorrow. So that'll be fascinating to see the developments on this. But there is pressure being put on Red Bull to come up with the, shall we say, correct solution, at least as far as they see it. This actually here from the Financial Times, and they go on to say that the understanding is that the Ford-Red Bull partnership for 2026 can be terminated by Ford if they want to. So, Ford hasn't pressured the racing group to come to a particular decision, but it has stressed that it expects an investigation to be handled seriously and rapidly. I think that's the other point as well, that the FIA, Formula One, Ford, Red Bull partners for the engines of 2026 are getting across. It's like, look, get to a conclusion here as quickly as you feasibly can. Ford is planning to re-enter F1 alongside Red Bull from 2026, but apparently the contract in place means that if Ford want to walk away at any time, they can, and that is probably not something the Red Bull are particularly keen on doing. Even if the Thai side of Red Bull has Horner's backing, that's one of those potential losses that would make them change their mind and potentially agree with the Austrian side of the business on the future of Christian Horner in that particular role. Now, Marko was also discussing in some depth the Red Bull RB20 and effectively confirming that they will go for a more Mercedes-esque design with the zero pods as they're being described. So he does say that it's not an evolution, the RB20, it's a small revolution, and they will go to severe lengths to try and make this car even more dominant than last year's. He did say as well, though, that the design that we rumoured that they're going to bring to the RB20, which is effectively going to be a zero pod-esque looking thing from the W13 and 14 at the start of those respective seasons, they are going to do something like that. He said, though, it's not as extreme as Mercedes interpretations, but the team does go from the idea in the same direction as Mercedes, saying that in the simulation, in the wind tunnel, it all worked very well. But of course, Mercedes said the same thing. We will now see during the test whether we can successfully carry out this solution, or let's say a similar solution, because rumour has it that from Japan, that's where they're going to unveil the real zero pod, as it were, and until then, they've got some Mercedes concepts in their car, but they haven't got all the way. Even Adrian, he mentions Adrian Newey here and says that Newey would love to have a car without radiators, i.e. no cooling at all, because that makes the most efficient car, but of course, cooling is to some degree necessary, but that was one of the changes that Mercedes had to make the zero pod work, was that they had to find other ways to cool the car, and it became rather challenging. So Red Bull are also having to make similar sacrifices in search of more performance. But Helmut Marko does admit this could backfire on Red Bull, and I think realistically this is the only way that the season isn't a runaway Verstappen domination fest, is if they actually have got this wrong, because he does say the data looks good in the sim and the wind tunnel, but he is still wary as Mercedes were also convinced by the data of their side podless concept. In practice it didn't work at all. So, that's absolutely confirming that Red Bull will do something very similar, because he says that, yeah, well, we're a bit concerned because Mercedes also saw great results, but Mercedes constantly said that it wasn't just the zero pod that was causing them the lack of performance, and Red Bull have such a good mechanical base and platform and floor and suspension, all these other features. If there's any team that can make it work, it's obviously got to be Newey and Red Bull. And other teams that have taken inspiration from the RB19 are possibly going to be some way behind the curve, even as he says. Other teams might have copied the model that is not the most up-to-date. And even I think Marko and the Red Bull guys mentioned that when basically Perez would crash the car, the other teams would get to see the floor, but they said, well, give us a few races and certainly next year we'll have a brand new floor, so you're not really going to learn that much. Now, was that some degree of misdirection, right, from the Red Bull guys to say, well, you know, this is our current floor, our future floor is going to be even better and bolder and you guys haven't seen it yet, but maybe that's just misdirection in the same way that other teams do it as well. Like we saw the other day, Aston Martin, for example, they blurred out their diffuser in a promo video. McLaren quite often blur out or leave parts of the car blank in their reveal, and then when they reveal those parts, there's nothing really special going on. Arguably, it's a bit of misdirection tactics to try and drag the attention towards some part of the car that they think is fine, but away from another part of the car, which is arguably particularly interesting. Now, David Coulthard also mentions that the RB20 will have upgrades even throughout the weekend at testing, says that the launch iteration upgrades will be coming to the test up until the last day, and even possibly on the Friday of Bahrain, there'll be more upgrades. So Red Bull have a lot that they're working on here, and it's obviously tough to see past them again for the season. This is the test and exactly what the teams are going to do. Of course, it starts tomorrow. The teams are allowed to basically choose what tyre sets they take for the 3-day test. They all get 2 sets of inters, 2 sets of wets, although rather unlikely, I'd imagine that that's going to be necessary. But we have the white tyres, well, basically the C1 through to the C5, so the hardest compound through to the softest compound. They can effectively choose what they want of each. Now, the C3 is used almost every circuit, so understandably the teams generally have most of those. The teams really, though, are leaning towards the harder compound tyre, which tends to be more so the race tyre, than the qualifying tyres. But I thought it was interesting, the discrepancy here, really, because most teams have gone for quite a lot of the harder compounds, right? So C1, C2s, Alpine, for example, 11 C1s, 4 C2s, Williams have gone for 5 and 9, so teams are all over the place here, really. Red Bull have gone for 6 and 5. Mercedes, though, have gone for 2 and 2. By far the fewest hard compounds of anyone. They're putting their money really on working on the C3 yellow-backed tyre, which is usually the medium, but you know, sometimes it's the hard, sometimes it's the soft, depending on the Grand Prix. But that tyre is almost always used, and they've taken more sets of those than any other team has. But as a consequence, they have barely any of the harder compounds, which is an interesting decision because most other teams haven't done that. But Mercedes also have opened the allocation to take some C5 tyres. Only 4 teams even take any C5 tyres. And there's 2 teams, McLaren and Alpine, that haven't even taken any C4 tyres. So they're not going to do any testing at all, really, on qualifying runs or anything like that. Their program is going to be all towards race pace, it seems, whereas Mercedes are one of only 4 teams, and Ferrari included, that want to do some testing on the very softest compound, on presumably some one-lap pace. So I thought the discrepancy there was quite dramatic, really, between Mercedes and Red Bull and certainly other teams that have gone down a remarkably different direction. Williams as well unveiled their car today for pretty much the first time. There's been a lot of debate about Williams. Why? So they revealed their livery, but they didn't really show the proper car, and apparently that was because the car wasn't really ready. They'd either made some serious adaptations to it over the winter that meant that they couldn't do, as they were planning to do initially, I imagine, a Silverstone shakedown like Mercedes did, like McLaren did. You'd expect Williams to do the same. They didn't, though, so their first running of the car was today in Bahrain. Potentially because they're running a bit behind schedule or things haven't exactly gone to plan over the winter, doesn't necessarily send the greatest picture. But of course, we'll see over the coming days whether the car is any good or not, and of course, whether it's fast again in a straight line. Haas are not in a great spot, and I think they're making that clear to absolutely everybody. They're also saying, even in their test, that performance is not the priority, which is not really what you want to be hearing if you're a Haas fan, although there aren't many of those about, even if there ever were, certainly not anymore. The primary goal is to understand how the tyres work, which they've been suffering with for the last couple of years. So I guess that's the plan for Haas, is to figure out how the hell the tyres work on this car. I have like no optimism in this team this season. I don't really think anyone has optimism in this team this season. We've even had Komatsu say, their new team principal, that they're probably going to be 10th in Bahrain. So I think there's a lot of optimism around other teams and the progress they might have made. But yeah, Haas, I don't think people are really holding out hope so much. Now, Mercedes also took to the track for the first time today with their W15 at least, outside of the shakedown at Silverstone. They did like 5 laps. Today was their filming day, so they get 200 kilometers of running that they get to do today. This was a shot as well here of Lewis Hamilton coming down the straight of Bahrain today. So the car works. It doesn't appear to be porpoising, if you guys want to look into that, but of course we'll find out way more on all this stuff tomorrow and in the coming days. But the big question has been on Mercedes. How about this innovation, especially on the front wing department? This is the plan as well for running this weekend at Mercedes. George will do the Wednesday, Hamilton will do the Thursday, and then Friday they'll split between Lewis and George on the morning, afternoon respectively. But this is the front wing that's caught the eyes of many in the paddock. Now, their side pods are also an interesting shape, to be fair, but this is a front wing design that we've not seen anybody deploy since 2022, and in many ways is dramatically different to what they've shown up with over the last couple of years. But what really caught people's attention here is not necessarily this little like lower lip at the bottom, which has been a feature of, well, Red Bull introduced it, other teams have gone down this route as well because it seems to provide some cleaner airflow to the floor, but it's mainly around this little wire here on either side of the nose. And you can see in Kyle Engineer's analysis that he did here exactly what this is trying to accomplish. So this is the thumbnail from that video. You guys can see the vortex that is being generated here by this top element. So these elements typically will connect to the nose, and the regulations say that it obviously has to be connected to the nose, and we'll discuss why they changed it to mean this in a second. And also, when you view it from below, it has to stagger. So this legality wire, as it were, if you look from below, it will have to be offset behind the other elements. But as long as you satisfy those couple of parameters, then this is a legal design. So there's a couple of reasons why Mercedes have liked to try and explore this. Of course, by not extending the element all the way, they free up a bit of airflow to the front of the car, but also they might be able to generate a bit of a vortex. Now, it's not going to be anywhere near as powerful as the rather famous Y250 vortex, which you guys can see here on Sergio Perez's car from a few years ago, when all the front wing elements were pushed out by 250 millimeters. So it would generate, well, you guys can actually see the airflow right here, and this is another good example of exactly what was going on back then. They got rid of this because it generated loads of downforce, and it also generated loads of dirty air for the car behind. And that is where the debate around legality is really coming into play. By the rules, this is fine, and obviously Mercedes wouldn't design something which isn't allowed in the regulations, and they've unveiled this and given the teams and the FIA a good week really to analyse it before they take it to the track. The question is whether this is in the spirit of the regulations, and that's the classic thing that the regulators say, and we'll discuss why they say that here in a second and exactly what that means. But as was described here in Formula Uno today, it has been deemed illegal, this front wing, by the FIA, the governing bodies. This is what the author goes on to describe, that it's not a complete novelty. The Alpine actually has done something a little bit similar last year, but nothing to quite this extreme. We talk about the Y250 vortex. Reproducing that today is not really going to be possible, but they kind of discuss exactly why that should be beneficial to the car. But as it goes on to say, insiders from 2 teams have confirmed there appears little reason for the W15 front wing to be deemed illegal. Mercedes have confirmed, apparently, that it's received the green light from the FIA. So that seems to be the discussion, that maybe, I don't know, Mercedes have told this particular magazine that it's officially going to be legal. But apparently it could be considered against the spirit of the regulations, because the regulations were primarily designed to prevent cars from generating harmful turbulence, air, dirty air, that kind of effect. And the FIA has banned some of these grey areas in recent seasons. We saw it with the Aston Martin rear wing. Let me just find you one of those. You guys might remember when Aston Martin pulled this out when they tried to replicate the pre-2022 rear wings, where you used to have the kind of the piece at the side to generate more vorticity, as it were. Now, they were able to technically do this in the regulations by making it a curved piece, which technically conforms to the rule set. But I think that was quite evidently going against what was intended by the rules, so they outlawed that going into 2023. But it's still a front wing Mercedes have. They've just cut off half of the top elements and they've replaced it by a small little piece of wire to conform to the regulations. There's a couple of reasons though why teams might be concerned about this, and the fact of the matter is, if the Mercedes car isn't very quick, then nobody's really going to care. But if the Mercedes car is all of a sudden very competitive, and this might be one of the reasons why, then other teams will, I'm sure, be trying to lobby the FIA to see if they can get this outlawed in terms of the spirit of the regulations, right? A couple of advantages this might potentially have, especially on the flexing part as well. What leaves technicians most puzzled is the chance that this last element flexes in a very accentuated way, since it's not structurally anchored to the nose, which can actually reduce drag. And this is one thing that we've talked about flexi wings actually over the last couple of seasons, and whether some of the wings were flexing too much than should be typically allowed. This connection with a legality wire maybe opens the door to when at high loads the element could flex in a way to reduce its downforce generated and therefore drag generated on the straights, but then snap back into place for the corners. And maybe it could do that more so than would otherwise be the case. That's one potential theory, that it can actually increase Mercedes straight line speed to some degree as well. But the other feature, of course, is that by generating some sort of vortex, even if it's not as extreme as the vortex that we've seen in the previous regulations, that is going to make it more difficult for cars behind to follow. And that's been a natural progression of the last few years. People talk about TD39, and I can totally understand that, but to be honest, over the last couple of years, the teams are adding more downforce wherever they can, and naturally, you generate more downforce, especially by the element of the car, the wings of the car, features like this. It makes it more difficult for the car behind to follow, and that's been a natural trajectory, and that's what these regulations were designed to prevent. But at the end of the day, it's a known factor by the FIA that the regulations have failed to some degree. They confirmed that in 2022 at Bahrain, for example, around about that time, there was a 50% reduction in dirty air from the 2021 season. But now, this year, last year, sorry, 2023, that was only down to like 30%. So over the last couple of years, the amount of dirty air and, well, the spirit of the regulations has been corrupted anyway. And this is just a terminology that people use to try and find ways to shut down innovation effectively. And maybe they're right to do that, maybe they're not. But there's a debate right now in the Formula One world as to whether this, because it's technically legal, whether it will remain that way, or whether if it happens to be particularly competitive, other teams might try and find a way to complain. My feeling is that I think any other teams, if they do try and make the FIA change their mind here, will have a hard time, because the FIA has been quite clear really in recent times. They're not planning to do much in terms of regulation changes before 2026. Their focus, as are the other teams' focus really, on those reg changes in 2026. So it doesn't seem to me, based on what they've said in recent months, that they're really planning to make major changes. So I guess we'll see what happens. The alternative is, of course, that other teams can also just replicate this concept. But if Mercedes were very confident this would be approved, as they seem to be, because apparently it has been, then they've probably designed the rest of their car around the way the airflow works, because whatever happens at the front wing determines what happens through the rest of the car. So other teams can't necessarily just replicate this design and slap it on their car, because that might not necessarily work with the way their car's designed. But we don't see the airflow here. That's up to, that's up to Adrian Newey, James Allison, and guys like that to figure out. So that's the update for today. Positive news, of course, for Mercedes for the time being, but we'll see if that translates to actual on-track performance over the next couple of days. So Bahrain testing begins tomorrow morning. Very exciting stuff. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate it. Not for our 40,000 subs now. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.